Hello, and welcome to 2024 Moss Adams Alternative Investments Virtual Conference. We are pleased that you are able to join us. Before we get started, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, a few more housekeeping items. The first part of the conference will total 2.5 CBE credits, and the second part will total 2 CBE credits for a total of 4.5. Per the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy, to qualify for these credits, you must attend the one-credit sessions for a minimum of 50 minutes and respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions in each session. For the session offering 0.5 credits, you must attend for a minimum of 25 minutes and respond to at least 2 of the 3 polling questions. Today's conference will be broken out into 2 sessions. Part 1, which we are in now, will contain 3 topics and go until 11:45 Pacific Standard Time. Then we will have a 30-minute break and start back up with Part 2 at 12:15 Pacific Standard Time, where we will finish off with 2 more topics. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Syed Rizvi, partner here at Moss Adams, to get us started. Syed?
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our 2024 Alternative Investment Conference. Laura said, I'm Syed. I'm a partner with Moss Adams Asset Management Practice, focusing on venture capital, private equity, and other private funds. As you know, navigating the private funds landscape continues to be a challenge with continuously changing compliance environment. So we have designed this conference specifically in mind to provide a forum to discuss relevant topics that we face as industry professionals. As always, we welcome you to ask questions throughout the sessions. There's a Q&A chat box to the bottom right of your screen. If you're unable to respond to your questions during the presentation, we are taking notes and we will get back to you promptly. As Laura mentioned, we have the conference broken up into 2 sections with a 30-minute break in middle. We will stick to our time as closely as possible, but there might be some variation as our discussions get going. Before we kick off our keynote spec with Daniel here, Laura, can we run to a couple of polling questions?
Definitely. Polling question number 1. What are you most looking forward to from this conference? A, listening to investor perspective on the economy and markets. B, getting tax update. C, learning about SEC compliance. D, earning CPE/CE credits. Or E, all of the above. Okay, we'll give people a few more moments to respond here. And as a reminder, you can select the answer that you would like to choose and then click Submit. All right, we'll pass over to the results. Okay, looks like we have a variation. And we'll go to the next polling question. What is your primary industry? A, venture capital and private equity. B, hedge funds and mutual funds. C, banking and fintech. D, real estate. E, other. As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. And we'll give people a few more minutes to respond, or moments actually. All right, and here are the results. You can take it away, Syed.
Thank you, Laura. And now I would like to welcome Daniel Dar, our keynote speaker. Super excited to have Daniel joining us for this keynote session. A little about Daniel. Daniel Dar is the founder and solo GP of Rockyard Ventures. Daniel is a leader and advocate for undeserved and underprivileged community. He has worked on the ground, helping build equity and social movement on both local and global scales. Daniel matriculated to the London School of Economics, graduate school without even ever receiving an undergraduate degree. In addition to being published in Harvard Business Review and the World Economic Forum, he has presented his academic and economics research worldwide, including Sri Lanka, China, Ireland, Japan, and the US. Daniel's journey to where he is today is anything but typical. He was born in the Bay Area, but spent most of his youth in Southern California. He experienced homelessness on the streets of San Diego and Los Angeles, a chapter of time that shapes everything he does today. Daniel was also brainchild of a prominent punk rock band, Time Again, where he wrote and sang songs about social issues, poverty, and getting through life one day at a time. Daniel also holds an MBA from MIT, where he is the first formerly incarcerated student in his school's history and recipient of the Dean's Fellowship, Sloan Leadership Fellowship, and Pichak Fellowship Awards and Scholarship. I can go on, Daniel, but your accolades are amazing. At this point, I will turn it back over to you, and please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for introducing me. And it's always interesting to hear your own bio. It's kind of a unique perspective. So thank you guys so much for joining. We have about 45 minutes, and I'm going to do my best to kind of keep you entertained and tell you a little bit about my story, and hopefully you guys can glean some stuff. So by all accounts, where I am today should be impossible. 10 years ago, I actually was sitting in a prison cell for a crime I didn't do. I ended up getting out on appeal. But prior to that, initially, I thought I was going to do 180 years in prison. So it was pretty wild. In between then and now, as he mentioned, I got a few degrees from London School of Economics, an MBA from MIT. And as I like to say, life kind of begins when you realize that the rules in many cases are malleable and there are no gatekeepers, right? When I got asked to do this talk, the first thing I looked into was the history of accounting. I didn't really know much about it, and it was interesting to look back that the first signs of accounting were 8,000 BCE with trade. And so one of the things I thought as I was talking about is accounting is really the profession of truth. So you guys are the truth keepers and kind of a very important person in society. And so I thought that was very exciting. So I'm going to kind of jump into it and tell you right now that I kind of look at life by big days and little days. And there's certain big days that I had that really radically changed my life. And in between, there was a lot of little days. One of the big days was September 5th, 2014. That was the day I got out of prison when I won my appeal. It was about 5 a.m, and a guard came up and tapped my bunk. I expect many of you, probably most of you, have not been to prison. But at that day, I didn't know if I was going to win my appeal. I didn't know what was going on. And at that day, I had been in prison over 3.5 years. Was in one riot where the prisoners overtook the prison and National Guard had to come take it back. Was in another situation where there was a hunger strike. So I did that for 5 days. And there was a lot of ups and downs. As that happened, I feel a little tap on my bed. And the guy said, "Hey, wake up. It's your time to go home." Now, I want to paint the picture for you and imagine a long kind of hallway. There's about 90 beds, half of which were full of about 45 different prisoners who were serving anywhere from, 18 months to 10 years. And I wake up and I look down, and the first thing I asked him is I said, are you sure? At that point, I'd kind of given up on whether I was going to get out of prison that day or not. I didn't know. right? And so at that point, I just wasn't sure. I'd lost hope. He said, yes, you're going to get out of prison. And behind him were about 15 people who I had been in prison with. And they throw on some music. We have little kind of boom boxes in there, and we danced and celebrated. I talk about that because that was one of the biggest days in my life that I think about quite a bit. But most of the progress I made was through little days. Okay. So that day I got out, I had about $200 in cash and a pair of sweatpants that were about 2 sizes too small for me. And I had to go rebuild my life. So I'm going to kind of jump around now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my early years and how I grew up and where I grew up. So I was born and raised up until 13 in the Bay Area. My dad ran a lumber yard and a rock yard, and that's how I got the name for Rock Yard Ventures. It was pretty much my carrying on my dad's legacy. I grew up in what I would say, in my estimation, is a very similar kind of family as many of you. Middle class, blue collar, working, and there was a lot of tumultuousness, right? Growing up, I didn't know where I fit in. And even in my 20s, I didn't know where I fit in. At the age of 13, I entered into the system through reform schools and lockup and detentions, spent some time homeless, and ended up being locked up from 16 to 18. At 18, I ended up getting out, still lost, and ended up homeless and in and out of jail. The first time I went to adult jail, I was actually the youngest person on a yard of 5,000 people. I remember the first day of that too, another big day, walking into jail, being like, oh my God, everyone's so big, right? I was terrified. Oddly enough, I'm probably more terrified to give this talk and this speech here today. And so those things never change. Now, fast forward a few years, my life is a total disaster. I'm living homeless. I'm all over the place. And here we are. I got nothing. And I end up getting arrested again, this time for a gun charge. And I was going to face, they wanted to give me 7 years, right? So they said, hey, we're going to give you time in prison. Because of that, I just flipped out. It was the only time I had agency. So no matter what, even though I was totally guilty, I refused. I refused to take a plea deal. Like, let's take it to court. Probably about 2 months prior, 3 months maybe, my best friend had been shot in the back multiple times and killed. I didn't want to go along to get along anymore. I don't know. At that point, I was too immature to understand really anything about life. And so I flipped out on the judge, told him to F off, and said, let's go to court. Well, because of that, I ended up having to do a psych evaluation. With that psych evaluation, he came, he said, hey, why did you yell at the judge? And I said, man, my whole entire life, I don't know. My life's a disaster. I've been in this placement and that placement. People are getting shot and killed. I don't know. I'm going to make things, I have no control. And so the only control I have right now is to make things as hard as possible for the system. And it might sound counterintuitive, but at that point, everything had been dictated for me. Go here, do this, you should do that, you should do this. It was never a conversation. And I was just sick of it. So I ended up talking to that psych for about 2 or 3 hours. And the whole moral of that story was like, yeah, man, I'm carrying a gun because I'm absolutely terrified. My best friend got killed. We're getting shot at. And here I am, this teenager. And what am I supposed to do? At the time, I lived in this studio apartment. There's 4 of us. We only had one outlet that worked. And I worked in the morning as a telemarketer selling air hoses. And at the evening, I worked at Quiznos Subs. No matter what I do, I couldn't catch a break. And I remember talking to the psych, just being like, hey, the only control I have, I know I'm going to prison because I always go there, right? I always end up here. That's what my life is. That's where I felt like I deserved to be. That's where society told me I should be. And I'm just not going to make it easy. A few weeks later, I go back to the court. The judge has my juvenile file open and all this stuff. And he says, hey, instead of going to prison, we want you to go to a program and we want you to work with a counselor. I call this my Goodwill Hunting moment. This was the judge that gave me my Robin Williams. And so I remember saying, wait, I don't have to go to prison. I could get out today. And they said, yeah, you could get out today. You got to go to this program, though, for 6 months. The foreshadowing, I think, is interesting because, like I say, it's a Goodwill Hunting moment. 15 years later, I would end up at MIT as the first student ever who came from prison to MIT. So I end up going to this program. I meet a guy named Les Lazarus. And it's important that I say his name because if you Google Les Lazarus, it's almost like he doesn't exist. The only time his name pops up is in articles of press that I've done. And it's very important that I say his name and that he matters. It's getting me emotional because he was one of the individuals that's changed my life. And I think that's really important for you guys listening because you never know when you can change someone's life or you never know when someone else can change someone's life. And I'm going to talk about it more as we get into it. But this was the first person that sat me down and said, what do you want? What do you want your life to be? Who do you want to be? And it's the first person that really inspired me to always say, it doesn't matter if no one's done it before you, then be the first. And so I approached life like that in many ways. I don't care if no one's done it before. I will be the first. So I end up going to this program, and he ends up inspiring me to start, I say the band, my band called Time Again. And I always joke, if I knew the band was going to be as successful as it was, I probably would have picked a better name. But the name Time Again, and if you Google Daniel Dart Time Again, you'll see all sorts of fun stuff come up. But at that point, I had very little hope and success. And so I named it Time Again because I didn't know how to hold on to hope. And so I go, here we go again. Another time I'm going to try and break out of this cycle. And I called it Time Again. Well, everything radically changed. 6 months later, we end up having a record deal. Less than a year later, we're on tour. And we ended up putting out 5 records, getting gold records, touring the world multiple times, winning Rock Song of the Year, and got nominated for a bunch of other awards. And my life radically changed. Fast forward a little bit. Now I'm 30 years old. I don't like being in a band. I don't like those things. I'm hanging out with people I had grown up with, and I get arrested. Another very, very big day. It was a Friday night. I'm working on some music actually in the studio, and I walk outside and it's surrounded by guns, police. They're like, you're under arrest. When I first got arrested, I didn't even understand what it was for. They started listing out all these charges, and I'm like, wait, what? What's going on? And they said to me shortly after, hey, if you tell us kind of what your friends did, we'll let you go. I'd like to pretend like I was all tough and said, oh, I'm not saying anything. The truth was I didn't know what they were really up to because if I knew, then I would be involved. So I never wanted to ask questions, although I knew that maybe so-and-so shouldn't have a Ferrari or so-and-so shouldn't have a Lamborghini. What ensued was 3.5 years in prison. When I first went, they said, hey, we're going to offer you a deal today, 180 years. And the public defender actually told me it might be worth taking because it doesn't constitute a life sentence. And so I would have more privileges and could go on a lower security yard. It's wild. I ended up not taking the deal and fighting it and eventually going to prison and getting it overturned. Another very, very big day. And I always want to kind of tell this story because I think it's important for all of us to remember the most difficult days. Because right now I work in venture capital and I hear people, oh, it's a hard market, or oh, I have this, or oh, I have that. And it's so important to keep it in context, right? Because yes, the market may be hard, but realistically, on a scale of 1 to 100, for people that are super fortunate, super lucky, super privileged, to the opposite end, I truly believe everyone on this call is in that 99th percentile. And so the reason why I talk about a lot of these big days is to consistently keep it in context, right? And so I'm going to kind of paint the picture walking into a state prison in California. So you're on the bus, you're shackled, you have your hands and your feet, and you're kind of doing this. They do that. The first thing they do is they strip you down completely naked, right? So imagine 100 people completely naked, and you might stand there for an hour, 2 hours while they go through the process. Then a guard walks up, and as you look across, you can see guards on catwalks with Mini 14 assault rifles that are walking, big spray painted on the wall stencils, warning, no warning shots, which I always thought was kind of ironic that it said warning, no warning shots. And he comes up and he goes, how many people have been in prison before? Some hands go up. And he goes, what does this sound mean? And they sound the alarm. Okay. Bah, bah, bah. And someone goes, he goes, what does it mean? And someone goes, it means prone out. And he goes, okay. What prone out means is lay on your chest with your hands and legs out, you know, like you're doing a snow angel on your chest. And he goes, I want you to know, does everyone understand what that means? And he walks down one by one. Yes. Do you understand? Yes. Do you understand? Yes. And he goes, if we make that sound and you do not prone out, we will shoot you. And I remember thinking, oh man, my life is never going to be the same. You're there, your friends don't matter, your family doesn't matter, you're completely isolated. And I remember thinking, wow, my life is over. My life is over. I'm never going to have another life. Being so broken and depressed, thinking, man, what's the point? In retrospect, I could not have been more wrong. In retrospect, going to prison is the best thing that ever happened to me. I can make that argument really good. Today, I have a great job I love. I have an amazing partner. And at least once a day, I actually say, wow, we got such a great life. It's amazing. I'm so grateful. Last week, a small thing, a little day, we went to Costco and the fridge was so full. I remember thinking, wow, this is amazing. I remember a time when I was 18 and we had lost power and even the gas got cut off where I lived. And I remember eating raw potatoes. I was so hungry. And now it's totally changed. So I end up in prison. It gets overturned. I get out. Now here I am in 2014 with nothing, living back in a halfway house with 16 other men trying to rebuild my life. The first job I had was a maid. I changed sheets. And I'm extremely proud of that job. It was honest work. I showed up every day. I took a lot of pride in it. It gave me enough money to feed myself and go to the movies and get the things that I wanted. It was weird because at that point, I never thought, oh, I don't have enough or I need more. And it was a blessing. And now we're going to talk about like the opportunity set of surrounding ourselves with amazing people. And how do you create serendipity and how do you create luck? So I truly believe that we can create luck. I truly believe that we can create serendipity. One of the things that I learned about prison is you will be judged by the company you keep, right? It doesn't matter. If you hang around people that are doing bad stuff, you will be judged accordingly. So as I got out of prison, I thought the opposite. Okay, if I know that hanging around people doing bad things can get me to prison, then my goal now is I want to hang around the best people possible. And that was like square number one. So I didn't want to go back to music. I had just been out. And as I had mentioned earlier, I didn't have the strongest relationship with my family. So I didn't hear from them for probably about 18 months post-prison. So I'm working this job as a maid. I had touched base with a few people. And all of a sudden one day I'm in between changing sheets between tenants. And I hear my name. I'm drinking coffee at a coffee shop. Hey, Daniel. Wow, hey, this man, I thought that was you. I thought you were in prison. I go, yes, I was in prison. And those two fellows, a guy named Ryan and Brian, and Brian from a band called Weezer. And Ryan was one of the guys who managed him. He said, hey, what are you doing, man? What are you doing with life? I said, well, I'm working this job as a maid. Just, do you need a job? I said, doing what? And he said, come work with us. Come work on the management team. And I said, yes. I said, that's great. So that was another big moment. So I ended up joining the management team and managing day to day for Brian Bell of Weezer. I didn't want to go back to music and be an artist, but I understood the music business. And at this point, again, I didn't realize that my skill set was transferable. So I ended up managing him, had a little bit of luck, ended up signing another artist, had a little bit of luck, ended up signing another artist, right? So now as I'm kind of going through these processes, I'm understanding, hey, actually the skill set I have of building a band and being able to understand EQ and manage spaces and volatility is transferable. So I end up launching my own management company. And the first kind of big artist I signed was a group, Jurassic 5, that did work with Seal, Santana, and still with Weezer. As that was happening, there was a really bad shooting that took place. And so I talked to Brian. I said, hey, man, I'd love to do an anti-gun violence campaign. And he goes, sure, let's do it. So we ended up building this campaign that eventually got picked up by the California Wellness Foundation and was called Enough. Enough is enough, and eventually became a toolkit that many young people used to battle gun violence. Through that, I got an opportunity to be connected with the Obama administration and help and advise their national and global campaigns. And so my management company started building out campaigns, and it turned out I was really good at pulling together diffuse partners and building a cohesive strategy that leveraged all of these different stakeholders. And so my management company shortly after turned into a strategy firm. I caught my next big break when I signed a big client, the Bezos Family Foundation. That was my first big external client, and I was the first outside consultant that they ever worked with. From there, I ended up signing deals with Save the Children globally, ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Wounded Warrior Project, HBO, the Duplass brothers, and I was off to the races. I knew I didn't want to do music, and I wanted to think bigger. Again, just because no one's done it before me doesn't mean I can't be the first. Along the way, there's a few things that I've always brought into my life, and now I actively do. One of them is called active learning. So one of the things I try to do is I try to take 10% of my life and make sure it's some type of active learning. I'm either reading books or taking courses or doing seminars. And I actually do that because the compounding effects of that are immense. So we're going to talk about that a little more. So now I'm like, hey, I'm building these campaigns. I'm really into it. I want to think bigger. Okay. I end up meeting a guy named Gunther Schoenlinter. Gunther at the time was the executive director at the board of the World Bank. And I met him and I asked him, will you mentor me and will you guide me? And again, some of this is, I met these people, some of it's just cold emails. So I've sent, I don't know, maybe thousands of cold emails in my life. One of the things that prison taught me is like to don't believe what you think sometimes. I think we're all scared. I think we all have a little bit of imposter syndrome. And one of the great learnings I had I was in prison and I was at one prison yard and I was about to get transferred to another. You get a thing called a docket. And I don't know, maybe it's Wednesday or Thursday, it's sometime in the week, and I get a docket from the CO, the correctional officer. And it tells me in 2 days I'm moving. I remember thinking, oh my goodness, man, because you never know what's going to happen when you go to a new yard. You never know the dynamics, the politics, the kid writing. It's very volatile. And so once you kind of have your situation, you don't want to move. And there was this guy there named Joe Bell, serving a life sentence, and his nickname was Insane. Okay. He was in prison for homicide. And I have to say, he was truly a bit insane. And he came up to me and had gotten to know him over the previous year. And he goes, man, how you doing? I heard you're getting transferred. Yeah, I'm getting transferred. He goes, it's okay. Are you scared a little bit? I said, I'm just, who knows what happened? He goes, yeah, I get scared when I get transferred too. And I remember thinking, what? You're insane, right? Like, you're Joe, like, you don't get scared. I said, you get scared too, man? And he goes, absolutely, man. Right? And I remember thinking, and I can truly say this, probably the toughest guy and the craziest guy I've met in my entire life, telling me, hey, man, it's okay to be scared. When I was preparing for this talk today, man, I was scared, right? I'm scared all the time. But what I know is that will not dictate whether I show up or not. No matter what, I'm going to show up. That's like my first rule. I will always show up. I will never forfeit. I will never let you beat me because I'm too afraid to try, right? I'm going to make you earn it. And that goes across all of the life. I'm always going to ask. I'm always going to say, will you help me? Will you do this? And then on the counter to that, I will never give up, right? You're going to have to forcibly stop me from trying. So I end up getting this opportunity, meeting the head of the World Bank, becomes a buddy. I get an opportunity to go overseas. And next thing you know, I'm working in Algeria, Ghana, Uganda, on all these different social impact campaigns. And I learn about economics. Up until then, I had heard the term, but I didn't know what it was. And so I just get voraciously into it. And I'm like, wow, how can I create a world that is better? So I start reading about economics online. I start watching these YouTube videos because through working with the World Bank and the UN, I had learned about entrepreneurship and I had learned about venture capital. And I thought it was just fascinating. I was like, wow, this is amazing, because not only can you invest at the early stages and impact the outcomes, but the thing I loved, the majority of the equity stayed with the founder, or it stayed within the community where it was built, or there wasn't this long tail if it didn't work out. So it wasn't like, hey, if this company fails, you're not in debt forever. I was just fascinated by that. And so I wanted to learn every single thing I could. That led me to eventually learning about Google Scholar. And I was blown away because remember, I had never graduated in regular high school. I had never graduated undergrad. And I didn't realize that there was this online source that had free academic papers. And I was blown away. And I was just down the hole. I saw YouTube and I would watch these YouTube videos about economics and microeconomics and different types of financial tools, one of which was created by a guy named Josh Angrist, who was a professor at MIT and won the Nobel Prize for economics a few years ago. So I ended up watching this, eventually started cold emailing Josh and became friends. And eventually I read an academic paper that I thought was incorrect. So I said, I'm going to write my own academic paper. So I started to work on my own academic papers. It started slow, right? Eventually I had one that caught fire and I got asked to come present at Trinity College in Dublin. It was actually mind-blowing because at the time I didn't realize that it was unique or novel that someone that had no formal post-secondary school was writing academic level research. So I end up getting asked, and they're getting ready to do the promotion. They go, yeah, like, what school are you with? And I remember asking, wait, what school? And they go, yeah, where do you teach? I don't teach. They go, well, where'd you go to school? And I remember being like, where did I go to, like, what do you mean, high school? And they were like, well, where'd you get your PhD? Like, where'd you go to uni? And I thought, well, I didn't. And that really opened a lot of doors for me. And again, proved that just because no one's done it before me doesn't mean you can't do it. So I end up presenting, and next thing you know, it takes off. You know, I presented all over around the world. I have different iterations, start other working papers. Eventually, my consultancy now, instead of managing one or two people, we're managing 20, 30 projects in 12 different countries with over 100 different employees. And I end up getting the opportunity, forcing the opportunity to go to school. That same mentor said, hey, maybe it's time you get some formal education. So in 2020, I wanted to go to London School of Economics. It was the top economic school in the world. It was also where Gunther had gone to school, and 33% of all Nobel Prizes in economics came from that program. But there was a rule set by the Board of Regents that you had to have the prerequisites. Again, I didn't care. So I wrote a letter, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I asked World Bank executive directors, I asked prime ministers, all these people that I had come to meet, will you vouch for me? Will you give me this opportunity? Eventually, I had asked every department head, and they had all said no. So I wrote a long letter to the Dean of Admissions and the provost of the school and said, hey, I understand that you have these prerequisites, and I understand there's a reason for that. But I also believe that the world has changed significantly. We have all these social movements. You have Goldman Sachs, you have Google, you don't need things. How can I have an equivalency offered? I would love the opportunity to present to the board and change it. The following day, I end up getting an email back saying, thank you for your well thought out letter. We don't need to talk to the board. We can change it right now. We would be honored if you would be the first. And so I said, yes. It was funny, a few days later after I got accepted and they started to onboard me to do the master's program, right? Just skipping over undergrad completely. I get a note and she said, please do really well because they're going to be watching. And I did do really well. So I ended up doing 2 masters actually simultaneously, also the first person ever allowed to do that. And then shortly after, got a fellowship to go to MIT. I tell you all of this not to brag. I tell you all of this because some of you, I imagine, are going through hard times. Some of you may have kids, sons or daughters, brothers or sisters that are going through hard times. And I just kind of want to reinforce that just because things are hard today does not mean they will also be hard in the future. So important to tell yourself that all the time. Or as my mom would say, this too shall pass. Now, I'm at these schools and I had known, hey, eventually I want to start a venture capital firm. Eventually I want to start a venture capital firm. Eventually I want to start a venture capital firm. So the minute I get the opportunity, I'm writing all these letters, sending all these cold emails, trying to get an internship, trying to get all of this stuff. But again, I don't have the right background. It didn't matter. Eventually, I go, well, if that's the case, I'll just start my own. Fortunately, I did get an opportunity, and I want to give a shout out. There's a firm called Alpaca VC who gave me my first opportunity where I ended up joining, and I worked with them for a while as a venture partner. If anybody on this call knows them, great people, and I just want to say thank you for that opportunity. And then also, when I ended up launching my own fund, the founder of Alpaca, Ryan, was a day one LP. And so I'm extremely grateful for that. So now I'm going to kind of reset once again. Okay. So I'm in school. I'm trying to build this life. I'm trying to change all these things and kind of doing it. And it's just wild. It's just crazy. One of the things that I contemplate a lot is that I'm a little bit older, right? So when I was at LSE, I was the oldest guy doing a master's there. Even though I had skipped undergrad, I was still, I don't know, 10 years older than everyone else. And so I try to think about these different things where a lot of times we have different comparison nodes, where it's like we're comparing ourselves to this and we're telling ourselves this narrative. I recently started reading a book about the individual who conquered the markets. It's a story of Jim Simons, the founder of Renaissance Technologies, who started Renaissance, which, according to the book and many accounts, is the most successful investment firm in history. And he didn't start it until he was 44 years old. I find that fascinating. Orange Theory, the workout place, the woman who started that didn't start it until she was 53 years old. And so I always remind myself that the stories we tell ourselves are so important, right? And it reminds me to be the first, because who did they compare themselves to? Who were them that started at 40 and 50? No one I could think of. They just did it themselves and they pursued their dream and they pursued their goal. And so I always think about that. Now, back to the thing I said earlier, who you surround yourself with is who you will be judged against. As I move forward in life and as I think about that more and more, my goal every day is to surround myself with the best people doing the best things. How can I do that? We understand social structures. We understand that people are in poverty are more likely to stay in poverty. The people that are wealthy are more likely to stay wealthy. And then in venture, a famous thing that Bill Gurley said is strength follows strength. So everything I do today is how can I create serendipity by positioning myself and being around people that I think are doing great things. And it's not just business. When I think of mentors, I want to find guys that have great families, who have great relationships with their wives, who have great relationships with their children. How do I learn that? How do I surround myself with that? Because you will inevitably rise to meet the expectations of your peers, or you will inevitably lower yourself to meet the expectations of your peers. And so a lot of what I do is, hey, how do I build that? The hardest thing I find is understanding when you're surrounding yourself with negative people and saying, hey, it's time to step away. That's something that I think I consistently have to focus on, especially coming from my background, because, hey, I've climbed up the ladder. I need to make sure I leave a ladder behind for others. And so I still do that, but how do I build that out? And so I always think that I think there's a moral obligation, to be candid, to help other people. I don't want to be around people that are selfish. I don't want to be around people that won't help other people. I don't want that either. And so how do I balance that? What I've done is I've created kind of a metric of a way, hey, if you'd like my help and if you'd like this, there's X, Y, and Z. I think that's very, very important, because I think when we think about life and all of that stuff and what are we remembered by and who are we going to be and all of these different things, another gift that I got through adversity. I say often, adversity is truly the greatest gift that anybody can get. Crucible moments, those are the important things, right? And heartache, trauma, crucible moments, all of those things, they're kind of like a sword. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad, in defense or in offense. And how do I put myself in positions to do that? I'm coming up shortly on time. And so I'm going to talk about a little more things that happened since we did post-prison. So now I run a firm called Rocket Adventures. Like I had mentioned earlier, it's kind of based on the work that my dad did. I see it as carrying on my dad's legacy, my family's legacy. My dad used to provide resources to builders and contractors and landscapers. Now I provide resources for those different things. I also mentioned that we had a tumultuous family, right? There was a lot of ups and downs. And for a long time, the biggest thing I had to get over was forgiving those closest to me. And it wasn't easy. I don't want to say, hey, you have to just forgive this, you have to forgive that. But what I do know and what I do learn is I don't want to let anybody have the control to dictate my emotions. I have very little control over externalities. Prison taught me that. Coming home from prison taught me that. There's a lot of things that I can't control. And I think sometimes it sounds a bit cliche, but it is cliche because it's true. So how do I wake up and control my thing? At the end of the day, I think the greatest gift I can give to anyone is forgiveness. And for me, having made a lot of mistakes, because just because I didn't do what they had said I'd done that time I went to prison, doesn't mean I didn't make a multitude of really, really bad choices in my life. I did. And I don't know who's listening to this right now, but like, I hope that if we were friends and you look at my past, you would give me the opportunity to redeem myself. You would allow me a second chance. And so I also want to live in a world that allows that for other people. And that's something that's very hard to do, is how can I create a world and a viewpoint that gives people the benefit of the doubt? How do I turn the other cheek? How do I do all of those things? And it's not easy. It's a daily practice. So in closing, the thing that I just kind of want to reiterate are my kind of mantras for my life and my family and everything is, one, I'll never forfeit. So I'm always going to show up, suit up and show up. I think that's 95% of success in life. And I'm not going to give up. Those two things, I think, sometimes sound a lot easier than they are. So please don't think that I do it easily and with a smile on my face all the time. I've spent more mornings waking up depressed than I care to admit. And then also, for all of us here that have hard days, whether it's ourselves, our kids, our loved ones, just be conscious that where we are today does not dictate or decide where we might be in the future. And with that, I just want to say thank you for giving me some of your time today. I appreciate it a ton, and I'd love to keep in touch.
Thank you, Daniel. If I would describe your stories of one of adversity and triumph. So I appreciate you taking time of your schedule and talking with us. You've been a great friend and a mentor, and hopefully stay in touch. For all of you who are looking for Daniel's information, it's linked in our console below. So please feel free to reach out. Daniel's super approachable. But again, Daniel, thank you for your time, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Daniel. With that, we have two more polling questions to close out the opening session, and then we'll have a break after that, and we'll reconvene at 10:30 to talk about tax updates. We'll turn it over to Laura after that.
All right. Thanks, Syed. Yes. Polling question number 3. What is your current geographic location? A, U.S. East Coast. B, U.S. West Coast. C, U.S. Midwest. D, U.S. South and Southwest. E, international. And a reminder again, To participate in the polls, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. Okay, we'll give people a few more moments to respond before going to poll in question number 4. All right, we have people from all over. Great. Glad you joined us. All right, polling question number 4. How do you prefer to attend industry conferences? A, virtually, B, in person, C, hybrid. We'll be getting into some more slides in the next presentation. So for any of you who would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast, along with a recording. All right, we're going to pass over to the results. Good to know. And then, like I had said, we're going to take a short break and then regroup for our next session. So please keep your console open and join us back here at 10:30.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Next up is our tax update. For that, I will hand it over to Josh, Irene, and Chris.
Thanks, Syed. I'm Irene Kling. I'm a tax partner in the Orange County, Los Angeles office, and I work on a lot of private equity, venture capital, and real estate clients. And so happy to be here today to share some of the federal tax updates. And I will be presenting with Josh and Chris, who they will introduce themselves, but they'll be covering the state and local tax update. Before we get started, let's just hop into a polling question.
All right, thanks, Irene. Oh, apologies, here we go. How prepared do you feel regarding potential impact of tax policy changes in 2025? A, very prepared. B, somewhat prepared. C, neutral. D, somewhat unprepared. E, not prepared. We'll give everyone a few moments to respond before we pass over to the results. All right. Here are the results.
Awesome, and that's what I would generally expect. So about most of us are neutral because we may or may not know what's changing, or maybe we don't. We want to wait and see what actually does change. So, all right. So just to set the stage of what we'll be talking about, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was this major tax reform that was passed in 2018, and it changed a lot of the way that we calculate taxes with certain provisions. When it passed and became effective in 2018, there was this phase-in period so that the direct hit to taxpayers was not as substantial. But under current law, those have phased out. And so we see things such as bonus depreciation being reduced down to 60% deductible for this current 2024 year. And then for next year, it will be down to 40%. There is a typo on this slide. 2026 is supposed to be 20%, not 2%. And the interest expense limitation, that was something new that came around through the TCJA. The ability to just deduct 100% of your interest expense changed and became limited to certain limitations of taxable income. When it phased in, there was the ability to add back depreciation and amortization. So the taxable income amount that you were using to calculate your 30% was higher. That is phased out currently. And under the Trump campaign, that would be proposed to be brought back. R&D expenses, many of us are familiar with the time when we were able to just go ahead and deduct R&D expenses and also potentially take a credit. That is now an amortizable expense, either over 60 months or 180 months. And Trump has, during his campaign, has discussed being able to just fully expense that again. Kind of hopping back up to the corporate tax rates, the corporate tax rates did get cut down to 21%. And what has been discussed during the Trump campaign is a 20% corporate tax rate, but an additional 5% reduction for companies that are manufacturing products in the US. So just to kind of summarize what we're looking at, if there is no legislative change, the current law, that column is set to expire on January 1st, 2026. But Trump is essentially proposing, let's bring it back or reduce some rates to what first came around in 2018. This slide covers some more provisions that are better related to individuals because as asset managers, we really care a lot about our owners. And so understanding what's going to change for individuals is crucial to what we do. Same theme here, where the current tax law has certain provisions that have come around under TCJA that have some relatively good limits and deductions, and those would essentially expire and get reduced on January 1st, 2026. But Trump has proposed that a lot of these get extended, and things like the estate tax limit gets adjusted for inflation. But again, if no legislation passes, then we'd be looking at the middle column of what is set to happen on January 1st. Let's see. I think in our industry, some of the big ticket items that we want to look at and pay attention to is the SALT deduction. Many of our entities in this industry are formed as pass-through, and Josh will be talking a lot more about the detail of that. But that is that was, you used to be able to deduct your state taxes, property taxes, and then now there's a cap on it of $10,000. But many of the states have gone around and enacted legislation to help make taxpayers a little bit closer to whole. And so many of those legislations are drafted in a way that if the SALT cap goes away, that legislation will go away as well. The big item here, portfolio deductions. Prior to the TCJA, this was an expense that we were able to deduct on our individual returns, subject to if we met some certain income thresholds. That deduction was taken away in its entirety for federal purposes under the TCJA. And I just wanted to add this to the deck to point out that it hasn't been mentioned during Trump's campaigns. And so, it's something to look out for to see how he intends to handle this specific deduction. General overview of what is going to be, where Trump's platform sits is that in order to pay for all of these tax cuts, he's talked a lot about major increases on tariffs. So this, if you think about the countries that he's friendlier with, Russia, North Korea, Israel, and then you think about the less friendlier countries being like China, the European Union, Mexico, you might want to consider some of that when you're doing some structuring or looking at investments or where your portfolio companies or your businesses are manufacturing, just to think about what's happening there. Another method of paying for some of these tax cuts is to pull back any unspent Inflation Reduction Act monies. This was an act that was passed under the Biden administration that was to incentivize taxpayers to invest in clean energy. And so there would be, we added solar panels to our house and we got a tax credit. So that is something he's talked about pulling back. One of the nice things about that is that there's an $80 billion IRS funding that was allocated under that act. And he has talked about pulling back any of that unspent money. And so most of that funding was allocated towards IRS enforcement. So audits, and the IRS had essentially announced that many of the partnerships and high net worth individuals were going to be audited because all the additional hiring they were going to do, they were going to focus on partnerships and high net worth. Speaking from experience, I've had my audits, I've never had a partnership be audited prior to 2 years ago, and that's increased to like 8 partnership audits since then. But I have worked on individual audits and other types of entity audits, but we really did see the impact when that funding and the hiring came through. Trump has talked about cutting 10 regulations for every new one. And I think we've all heard him talk about making tips, Social Security payments, and overtime pay tax-free. He's also talked about making interest expense on car loans tax deductible if the cars are manufactured in the US. And to pay for some of that, he's going to repeal some of the energy credits that we've been enjoying of late. So the question is, it's 2024. Trump will take office in 2025. How realistic is it going to be that there is tax reform next year? If you think about how legislation passes and becomes law, Trump does have the ability, he does have the votes in the House of Representatives, and he does not have the right number of votes in Senate. So to pass legislation, you need 60 votes, and he's got 53 Republican seats. So there is a workaround for tax legislation. In order to pass tax legislation, if you pass it through the budget reconciliation process, you only need 51 votes to pass that. This is exactly what happened in 2017 when he first took office, and he was able to pass legislation through the budget reconciliation process. So the one caveat in that, and it's kind of what we're experiencing now, is that if you pass legislation through the budget reconciliation process, it can't increase the federal deficit beyond the budget window, which is 10 years. And so that's why we're seeing some of these TCJA provisions set to expire on January 1st, 2026. So there's a good chance what is passing for tax legislation will have some sort of sunset term on it as well. So what's going to happen next year? In early 2025, the House of Representatives and the Senate will attempt to agree on a budget resolution. Once they agree on this budget resolution, the budget reconciliation process for enacting tax legislation becomes available, and we'll see the proposals that are written in this legislation. The Republicans may attempt to pass a concurrent budget resolution and utilize this process in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. So I think we'll see something soon about what's going to happen, and we will certainly stay on top of it and let you guys all know. So what can we do now with 3 weeks left in the year? For individuals, there are a few things you can consider and look at. One of the items I wanted to point out is a donor-advised fund. If you are anticipating rates to go up or down, you may want to look at either increasing your deductions or accelerating income, or deferring income, depending on how you think the rates will change and impact you. A donor-advised fund is a way to donate appreciated securities to get that fair market value tax deduction. And since the security is appreciated, you're avoiding the gain on sale because you're not selling it, you're donating it to a donor-advised fund. And you can essentially choose when to send out those funds from that donor-advised funds to the charities that you choose. I think Chris will talk about whether or not to consider deferring state income taxes and property tax payments. If we think that SALT cap is going away, it might be beneficial to defer your payments so that you can benefit from a higher deduction. And certainly if you were thinking about buying that electric vehicle or upgrading your washer dryer to some more efficient appliances, now would be the right time to pull the trigger because there's a pretty good chance those credits will be going away. Now for businesses, just want to mention these in case you're working with your portfolio companies. The bonus depreciation is set to go down to 40%. And so if you are looking at a major spend that cannot wait, then you might want to accelerate that into 2024. If you're looking at acquiring companies or maybe even selling yourself, I think you should contact us because we can help you understand what the tax impact is and how to structure your entity when you're acquiring, or how to structure when you're selling. The chances of if you're entering into a transaction today, it's probably not going to close in this calendar year, and so you want to have a better understanding of what that tax impact is going to be depending on what changes. And then R&D. If you feel like the ability to expense R&D is going to come back in 2025, think about deferring those expenses into the next calendar year. But if you're trying to slow down income because you're sitting on a lot of losses that you're not able to use, then we have a different tax situation. So there's a lot to think about when we have this uncertainty of what is going to change, if anything, and then also, one small change, but the lack of change in another area, like the ability to use NOLs, could change something drastically. So we are pretty good, and we really enjoy helping our clients understand what the tax impact is. We do a lot of modeling and kind of mapping out different scenarios. A lot of it is through mergers and acquisitions. It could also be through if you're looking at expanding into another state and you have some options of what state you want to go into, we can model those scenarios out, and it essentially helps you make these business decisions where we're helping you understand what the tax impact is and what the cash flow is over the current year and over the near future. Just with the uncertainty in rates and the potential drop of the corporate tax rate, down to potentially 15%, there may be a rush or a scare to just form a lot of C corporations, but that shouldn't be the conclusion that we jump to. You want to model this out because there is the 199A deduction. Trump has proposed to keep that. Although it's set to expire, that provision does allow for us to kind of level the playing field, so to speak, where a pass-through entity pays the tax rate of the partner, which is typically the individual at 37% versus the C Corp at 15%. That 199A deduction will help level that playing field. And so definitely reach out if you have questions and need some help understanding that. C Corps are not always the right answer because of that double taxation when you're trying to get cash out of it. Right, and we have another polling question, Laura.
All right. Yes, so at this stage of the game, do you feel more prepared regarding potential impact of tax policy changes in 2025? A, yes. B, this was a good summary, but I need to model the impacts. C, I'm waiting to see what legislation passes before taking action. D, no, please help. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions for each session. All right, we'll give people a few more moments to respond. And here are the results.
Awesome. No one wants help. That's great. I do want to just quickly mention the Corporate Transparency Act. There was a recent development on December 3rd. Many of us were probably scrambling to get our registration in because that was all due January 1st, 2025. A federal judge has temporarily suspended this filing requirement. And so if you haven't done it already, you can slow down a little bit. There is a good chance that it will kick back in and still be required, but they've suspended it in essence, saying that the corporate transparency is more of a state governance, and federal should not be involved in requiring this. And then just quickly highlighting 2 new tax forms for 2024. These are filed by partners, and so they won't be part of your partnership return, thankfully. We just would need to make sure we're providing the footnote information for the partners that have to report any kind of assets that are distributed from a partnership, if it's property. There's quite a lengthy form, and so there's a lot of information to put on there. And then there's an optional 83B election. And so if you guys were, if you had 83B elections that traditionally there's been like a Word document or a sample template that has been completed and filed, but now there's a fillable form that you can just populate, and it makes it a little bit easier to file those elections. Right. So I'll turn it over to Josh now, and they're going to talk about
Thanks,
state
Irene.
taxes.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Grossman. I'm a state and local tax principal based in San Francisco. Just for a little additional background, I think the majority of my career has been spent advising banks, financial corporations, asset managers, including 40 Act fund advisors, as well as many PE, VC, and hedge fund advisors in the state income tax realm. I always like to start with the joke about what we refer to it as SALT, state and local tax, but I have also heard that acronym described as stupid, annoying little taxes. That was used by a federal practitioner early in my career, and I've always borrowed it because I think it is kind of funny. And I don't think they are annoying or little, although many times they might be stupid. So with that, we can dive right in. As Irene had mentioned, we're in an area of uncertainty. Essentially, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 made certain provisions permanent, like the 21% corporate rate. Many provisions were set to sunset at the end of 2025. Many notable provisions like 199A, the standard deduction, standard personal income tax rates are scheduled to revert to their pre-TCJA levels. The state and local tax deduction cap, the limitation on qualified borrowing for the mortgage interest deduction, many of these things are scheduled to sunset. And we're waiting to see whether the new administration is going to extend these or adjust them. So we are in this period of flux. Irene had a great summary of all of the provisions that may be subject to change. Here's another little brief overview of some of President Trump's tax proposals. Again, we haven't seen any legislation. There are many that we feel like, 199A, relaxation of the required capitalization under 174. Some of these things we feel might be probable, but we need to wait and see. So we are in a period of relative uncertainty. So we're all eagerly awaiting to see what the administration moves forward with. So Irene had mentioned, and I had mentioned the state and local tax deduction cap. Just a bit of history. Prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, there was no limit on an individual's deduction of state and local taxes, except for the fact that they were a preference item often added back as part of the AMT, the alternative minimum tax. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did two things. It put in place a $10,000 limit on individuals, capping their ability to deduct state taxes. There was no contemporaneous limit placed on business entities. So business entities could continue to deduct state taxes, individuals not. At the same time, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also, and I have a slide on this later, we'll get into it, it did relax the alternative minimum tax and really did minimize its application significantly. So although the state and local taxes became capped, for many Americans subject to the AMT, it was already a preference item added back, so it couldn't be deducted in full anyway. So we saw a contemporaneous change where, yes, it's capped, but AMT goes away for many taxpayers. In response to the $10,000 limitation, we did see a proliferation of states noticing the difference between individuals and business entities. And in the pass-through entity realm, talking about partnerships, S corporations, and LLCs taxed as partnerships, the states began to say, well, what if I let individuals who are owners of these business entities pay tax at the entity level, and that tax shifting effectively allows that which cannot be deducted by an individual to be deducted by a business entity. So since 2017, we've seen a radical growth in states that allow these, that have enacted these regimes. 36 have adopted, we call it a PTET, or pass-through entity tax regime. They basically stem from the logic of an IRS notice 2020-75, which was promulgated during the first Trump administration. And it generally supported the deductibility of state taxes shifted from individuals to business entities that again, are not subject to the federal limitation. So should the SALT deduction cap not be addressed by new legislation in 2025, it would repeal and we'd return to pre-TCJA law, where we'd have the full federal deductibility of state and local taxes paid by individuals. But I would also add that's not the end of the story, because we also would have to think about the return of the AMT to its pre-TCJA level. So I'm going to jump on this slide to the bottom portion so folks can see a little bit of how the AMT looks in 2024 versus if nothing happens and AMT reverts to pre-TCJA levels, what it looks like in 2026. Now, this could be changed by federal legislation, but I think it's an important little area to highlight. So maybe backing up to the top of the slide, the varying approaches to the pass-through entity tax regimes. There are 26 that are permanent, meaning they're not scheduled to repeal or sunset contemporaneously with the federal SALT deduction cap. There are 5 that have a mandated expiration date and another 5 that expire when the federal cap expires. So one of the thoughts is that if the federal cap expires or is not extended, will the perceived need for these regimes change? Right now, they're viewed as a benefit to state residents in high tax jurisdictions, where they can deduct their taxes by shifting them to a business entity. If the SALT deduction cap expires and individuals can once again deduct their state taxes without a cap, will some of these regimes go away? Will some expire automatically or be repealed for states viewing it as not having the same essential need? I would caution against some of that if I were advising states, and I've been saying this when I speak with legislators. The AMT is scheduled to return to its pre-TCJA levels as well. So even if we can deduct all our taxes, if the AMT comes back with force, there could still be many scenarios where it's beneficial to shift your taxes to a business your state taxes to a business entity, rather than trying to deduct them yourself and having it disallowed as an AMT preference item. And to give the audience a sense of the magnitude of the AMT changes, according to the congressional CBO, pre-TCJA, the alternative minimum tax impacted 5 million Americans. And after the TCJA, once the exemption and phase-out levels were significantly increased, Since TCJA, it impacts approximately 200,000 Americans per year. So 5 million dropped to 200,000. And CBO projects that if the TCJA's AMT provisions expire or not extended beyond 2025, approximately 7.2 million Americans will be subject to the AMT beginning in 2026. So to synthesize this, even if the uncapped deduction returns, if the AMT were to come back in pre-TCJA form, it still might be beneficial to have these pass-through entity tax regimes around. But as I noted before, we're in a period of uncertainty. We don't know if the TCJA's AMT provisions will be extended. We don't know if the SALT deduction limitation will expire or be extended or be changed. Maybe it'll just be augmented. So we're just in limbo waiting to see. And this is, as I noted before, it's wise to view the potential return of the uncapped SALT deduction through the lens of the parallel return of the AMT calc. And we need to see how both of these items are handled in a legislative sense in 2025. And I do have a final bullet on here thinking about what are the pay-fors for extending federal tax legislation. Is there any risk of IRS Notice 2020-75 being pulled back as a potential way of raising revenue? I don't know. It's an uncertain area, and we're all just kind of waiting to see the tack that the next administration takes. And I think now it's a great time to talk about California. Both Chris and I are historical California specialists. We both closely follow this next update. And for this audience, California adopted what we call market-based sourcing of receipts from services and intangibles electively in 2011, mandatorily in 2013. And to implement market-based sourcing, the Franchise Tax Board that administers income tax in California has been working on a regulation update to our market sourcing regulations since 2015. So we're closing in on 10 years of this regulation project. Back in September, they finally, after numerous iterations of the regulation and interested parties meetings over the last 9+ years, they did post a notice of rulemaking on September 13th of this year, which also had a notice and a comment period that extended through the end of October. I know at least one comment was submitted, maybe more, and we're waiting to see whether an additional interested parties meeting will be scheduled to discuss the draft regulation language before it's finalized. I checked the FTB website this morning before this session, and I didn't see anything about another interested parties meeting, but my suspicion is because comments were submitted, there may be one. So it's unclear when the reg will be final. The last iteration had a 2024 effective date, and if it pushes into 2025, we'll be closely monitoring to see if that changes. So what's in it? It does a number of things. The prior reg that's currently in effect had separate cascading rule sets for sourcing services provided to individuals versus services provided to business entities. The new proposed rule set merges them into a single set of rules. It also contains simplifying presumptions for services related to certain things like real property, tangible property located in state, intangible property used in state, services related to individuals physically present. These new, they call them simplifying presumptions, are not part of the current reg, and the FTB has been pushing for them. They also have sourcing rules and reasonable approximation rules for sourcing receipts from government service contracts, new rules for large volume professional service providers, think law firms and accounting firms with more than 250 customers. And perhaps the most relevant to this audience, new sourcing rules for receipts from asset management services. And I thought this would be the right audience to dig a little bit deeper on this very last bullet point. So what are these new rules for sourcing receipts from asset management services? And when we say asset management services, we generally mean, or I think the FTB means, management, distribution, and administration service fees, typically computed as a percentage of assets under management of a fund. And a very important distinction here is that for many years, California has had specific industry rules for asset management services provided by mutual fund service providers. So those are 40 Act fund advisors. We've had rules since 2007 just for that industry. But those rules have been predicated on the presence or absence of advising 40 Act funds. So for asset managers outside that realm, the PE, VC, and hedge fund advisors who don't have any funds organized under the Investment Company Act of 1940, there's been a gap in guidance. And the FTB is trying to close that and borrow from the approach that it uses for traditional regulated investment company managers and map that into the PE, VC, and hedge space. So the first bullet notes this pertains to gross receipts from services not subject or businesses not subject to the existing rule for RIC advisors. It does mirror the approach taken in the existing regulation, and it attempts to look at the domicile of the underlying beneficial owners of the assets under management, be it if it's known or if it is a investor of record holding title for a different underlying beneficial owner. As I think I noted in the third bullet, the FTB wants to look at the underlying beneficial owners. So it does employ a look-through approach. And they provide in the draft regulation some examples of how this, the domicile of the underlying beneficial owner approach would shake out. And I imported, I thought, one of the clearest examples, and I was planning to walk through it. So here we go. If you have an asset management company, this is the advisor. It's the general partner in an equity fund, and it receives an AUM-based fee of 2% of assets under management. And let's say the equity fund has two limited partners, one domiciled in California and not holding the assets for the benefit of another, holds a 20% interest at the beginning of the year. And we're going to be looking at average ownership over the course of the year. That's why this is saying beginning of taxable year. So equity or limited partner one owns 20%, limited partner two owns 60% and is outside of California, but it's holding that 60% for its own, call it upstream investors, half of which are in California and half of which are domiciled out of state B. So at the beginning of the year, 20% is held by limited partner one, 60% by limited partner two. Half of limited partner two is California domiciliaries. So half of the 60 is 30 plus 20 is 50, right? So at the beginning of the year, 50% of the value of the interest in the assets is held by beneficial owners domiciled in California. At the end of the year, the value of the interest held in the asset management company and the limited partners have not changed, but the domiciles of the beneficial owners of limited partner two have changed and gone to zero in California within limited partner two by the end of the year. Thus, at the end of the year, only limited partner A, or limited partner one rather, has the 20% interest held by domiciliaries in California. So when we think about beginning and end of year average, we have beginning of year, the 50% we previously discussed, end of year, the 20, the averaging of the two is 35. So the FTB's answer is that 35% of the asset management fee received from the equity fund is sourced to California because the average value of assets held by beneficial owners domiciled in California at the beginning and end of the year is 35%. not the simplest rule set to apply, particularly when there are many funds and unknown underlying beneficial owners. For this audience, I would say I've seen a variety of approaches given these draft regs, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there. Many companies already preemptively follow this draft approach, and others, particularly out of state, asset managers may take a different tact and want to see the regulation finalized before they follow it. Anecdotally, I would say on audit, even though these draft regulations remain in draft and have not been finally adopted, I've seen the FTB attempt to apply the same logic on audit. So there's just a substantial amount of uncertainty in this area, and for better or worse, like the draft reg or not, when it becomes final, I think it will provide more certainty, even if it may not be loved by all. And I know that was a deep dive, and I appreciate everybody hanging on through it. And with that, I think we're headed toward a poll question, and then Chris is going to take over and talk a little bit about remote workers.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Yes. Poll number 3. How many remote workers are in your organization? A, none. B, 1 through 5. C, 5 plus. D, foreign-based workers. And E, still discussing. All right, and we'll give people a few more moments to respond. Reminder, once you have completed all CPE requirements for each section, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window. All right, and we're gonna close this poll, and hopefully if you're hearing some background noise, I'm gonna mute and we'll move on from that.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Those results are consistent with what we're seeing with a lot of clients, where remote workers are becoming a more substantive portion of the workforce of the organization. And so the rules regarding remote employment become more important. And then was there one more poll question, Laura?
Just a little bit. So you can go ahead and get started, and then we'll bounce to one in a second.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Josh, for all of your commentary, and Irene. To close out the question on whether or not the SALT cap is going to be extended or not, I heard another prognosticator the other day say the current budget estimate is that by letting go of the SALT cap, and we're going back to pre-TCJA, the 10-year estimate is about $1 trillion in terms of federal spending. And this prognosticator then went on to say there is a world in which the legislation actually waits until January 2 of 2026 to get that $1 trillion back on the books, so that they can count it as a savings to offset other programs that they want to use to spend that money on. So the idea that there is a lot of uncertainty is very real, and something that we're thinking about on a daily basis. And to Irene's point, we'll keep you posted. There was a question that maybe would be helpful for a lot of folks. If you haven't taken a PTEP before, please take the time to model out and look at the different state requirements, because while there are 36 states that have adopted a PTEP type program, it's 36 different sets of rules. Some of the states have very strict rules. Some of the states have somewhat lax rules. And depending on which state you're talking about, it may or may not dramatically impact your exposure and liability. I was on the dark side at the Franchise Tax Board for 11 years in FTB Legal's division before joining Moss Adams back in 2015. Been here since, and work with Josh on state and local tax issues, as well as controversy. If you picked up for an audit by the Franchise Tax Board, we work with you and represent you before the agency. The issue of remote workers for California purposes, because California has decided they want to be special and have not one tax agency, but 5 or 6, depending on what you count, a lot of the question of remote workers for California comes under the Employment Development Department rules, which are a little bit different than the income tax rules that we were talking about before. The reason that matters is because, like the PTET having 36 different programs, states have a wide variety of programs and treatment of remote workers and what is or what is not de minimis for that state. So what comes up as a question frequently is for folks that are outside of California but coming into California, whether it's to meet with colleagues or to meet with prospects or to meet with clients, is what happens? How much time can I spend in California before I'm subject to tax? In California, because we want to be the most aggressive state in the country, has a de minimis rule of $100 of compensatory income, which means that if you surpass $100 of compensatory income in a quarter, you technically have a reporting requirement in California. Other states have a de minimis rule of 14 days or 30 days. Other states have different amounts. So to the extent you have a remote workforce, particularly if they're moving around a lot, and we're seeing a lot of the younger generations wanting to be somewhat nomadic and enjoying the opportunity to work remotely for 2 weeks in Arizona and then 2 weeks in Texas and then 2 weeks in New York, that can cause a lot of questions about both payroll reporting and whether or not having an employee in the state creates nexus. And if that employee happens to have company property, like a laptop, now you have company property and a company employee in a state. And if you haven't been previously reporting to that state, you may be exposing yourself to questions of state taxability, use tax on the sales and use tax side. Personal property tax may come up as an issue as well. Those of you who answered still discussing on the remote employee question, one of the reasons for that question is developing policies and procedures to understand where your people are moving or where they're thinking about moving to before they move is really important, because it will enable your payroll group and your tax team to think through what potential obligations may arise. And keep in mind that certain states also have, in addition to just payroll reporting, have other requirements regarding vacation time. Washington State has the long-term health care requirement as part of their payroll. California has supplemental disability insurance as part of their payroll. So having folks in different states can create a litany of reporting requirements that you may not necessarily think about off the top when somebody says, hey, I want to remote work in pick your state and go from there. The other thing that comes up if people are spending times in multiple states is deferred compensation. And for anybody who has non-qualified stock options or RSUs, that grant to vest or grant to exercise period, again, depending on the state, can be modified by the state rules that may require reporting to that state if there was compensatory work done during that grant to vest or grant to exercise period. So the short version of the conversation is please preemptively track where your employees are and where they're thinking about spending time in order to make sure that you're not creating exposure both for your organization and for the employee that may be problematic down the line. Some things to think about: do you have an established policy on remote workers? Is HR aware of the physical work location of all your employees? Is somebody in your organization or somebody in your professional organizations you're working with regularly reviewing the employment tax and benefits laws applicable to the states where you have employees? And if you haven't taken the time to do that, as we're looking ahead to the years where states like California and Washington are in severe budget deficits, they are going to be looking for taxpayers to assess, and you don't want to be on that list if you don't have to. So take time to make sure that you have a very clear definition of when folks can move to another location, whether or not you want to have a physical office in that location, what property that employee may be carrying with them that is the business's property, and what obligations may arise out of that. And then a quick question on using an employee outsourcing organization or another co-employer. It depends again on the state, because different states have different rules regarding co-employment. And if you are using an employee organization or a professional reporting organization, you as the hiring agency are still considered a co-employer. They are not the employer of record. You're usually considered both employers of record, which can have liability issues associated with it. those employee organizations do typically have a lot more resources invested in tracking employees and keeping up to date on the latest developments for state tax and local city tax employment rules, where cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York City all have local rules. Those too can have a lot of impact on your business reporting. And now we are going to accelerate a little bit to catch up on time and move to the next polling question. Laura, I'll let you take that back.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Yes, polling question number 4. Are you considering expanding your business? A, yes, happening now. B, yes, in the next year or so. C, maybe, haven't decided yet. D, no, fine where we're at. E, recently moved and going well so far. All right, we have answers coming in. We'll give people a few more moments. And here are the results.
Well, that's exciting. I'm glad to see people are actively thinking about expanding. And that means you're going to need cybersecurity, which is a great way for Christian to take it over from here.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody. I wanted to go through some of the things that we have largely seen this year within the cybersecurity realm. There's been a number of legislative actions, regulatory actions, and then things that just happen. So we're going to talk through some of those things. First, SEC. So at the beginning of the year, at the end of 2023, the SEC issued new cybersecurity reporting requirements for public companies. There are really two pieces of the rule there. One, they needed and wanted within the 10K for there to be some disclosure about how cybersecurity risks were being handled within that organization. And the second piece was incident reporting. So there's a new form 8K to be used for any material security incidents. And those would have to be disclosed. I think this year, from what I've seen, there's been a number of, I think we're all still trying to figure out what that means and what it looks like. Determining what a material security incident is hard, because at the time of the breach, you probably don't know what the financial impact is. And there were some questions around whether this is financial materiality or, from a cybersecurity perspective, material. It's really difficult to adjudicate whether the breach will move your stock price in significant ways and those sorts of things. So, but we saw those things change. I think that as we've continued to see breaches happen, it's going to continue to drive regulation, because that's just how things work. And so I wouldn't be surprised that there are other things. Specifically for me, I spend a lot of time in other kind of government regulated spaces, whether that's federal or sometimes state rules. A lot of them are federal rules. And the SEC is not the only place we've seen new rules pop up. The FCC has created new rules for telecommunications companies. That continues to evolve. There are some big breaches that we'll talk about here in a minute that are driving that. But the point is, there's been a lot of things that have happened, a lot of new regulations. Other things that we've seen this year, there are some very material breaches, significant breaches within the world. Change Healthcare, 40% of US medical claims are processed by them. Some of you are probably impacted by that. I know I was. A large hospital network on the East Coast, Ascension Healthcare, were breached. Some of you may have been impacted by Ticketmaster or National Public Data. That one seems to have flown under the radar. And then there's the AT&T, Verizon, and Lumen breach that happened, I think, end of September, that continues to send waves through the world. And kind of the last overall thing is, we had an election. What does that mean with the changes that are happening in Washington, D.C.? How is that going to impact cybersecurity from a regulatory standpoint? So going over the SEC, issues. So the SEC issued the new rule in July of last year. It went into effect for companies filing after December 15th of last year. And then for processes and government, and some of the disclosures, anything that was after December 18th for the incident side. Like I said, there were a couple things in there that are a little bit tricky to understand. One was that the rule said you have to disclose a material incident within 4 days of determining it was material. The only exception within that process was if the breach is in relation to a national security item, and you'd have to get sign off from the government that that's national security related to do that. So that 4-day window becomes pretty tricky. So you need to make sure that your incident reporting, incident response process builds in some cushion in there to say, we need to do this check. So you have to move pretty quickly. Companies are required to disclose the nature, the scope, and the timing of the incident, and the material impact or the reasonable likely material impact to that entity. Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Determining materiality has been hard. One thing that we saw happen kind of early on in the year when Clorox was breached, they issued one of those Form 8Ks. A lot of organizations were trying to preempt it because they just didn't know if it was material or not. And so in effort to stay more transparent than less, they were sort of over-reporting. Later in the year, this year, it seemed the SEC came out and said, hey, that's not really what we want. We just want you to tell us when there's material things that are going on. So I think there's still some work to happen there as industry as a whole, we kind of figure out what that means. You also have to disclose your annual process for how you handle cybersecurity threats and risks within your environment. They want that process to be overseen by the board and management, just like with Form 10K is getting signed. It's interesting because a lot of times those processes are overseen by a chief information security officer or someone like that who doesn't sign the 10K. So that becomes a little tricky. It'll be interesting to see if that changes going forward. With SolarWinds, if you're familiar with that breach from a couple years ago, the CISO was personally identified in a Wells notice and then formally indicted later on, which I think it may have been the first time a CISO was formally indicted from the SEC. So there's some things continue to change in the cyberspace, and it's going to continue to change. So the things that we're seeing now, we're seeing more participation by boards, having oversight in cybersecurity governance. You may want to consider if you don't have a committee or a subcommittee to oversee those things, and make sure that management has the tools, people, process, and technology that they need to manage the cybersecurity risk landscape. That has also been kind of one of these sore points as things have happened, where companies have just not done the right things and said they were doing the right things, and that is where they've been caught up. Yeah, it's in Form 10K. I mentioned this earlier, Form 8K. I'm going through my notes and trying to make sure that we keep on time here. Materiality, things to think about in there. Is it going to impact your reputation? Is it going to impact your financial performance, your business value, actual and expected costs coming from an incident? So, which one was it? Both Caesars and MGM casino groups were breached a few years ago. Caesars paid the ransom as I think it started as a $30 million ransom. They negotiated down to 15. I think MGM came out and said they did not choose to pay the ransom. They wiped the systems and handled it on their own. They ended up, the total cost or total impact from that breach was about $100 million. So some of those things are going to be difficult to calculate. So make sure you know your materiality thresholds and you're tracking for the incident, tracking the costs, maybe lost revenues and all of those sorts of things that impact it. Think about the possibility of litigation, a regulatory investigation. All of those things should be considered when you're going through to determine if this incident was material. So you need to make sure that your incident response process accounts for those ideas as you go through that, and you continue to track them as you respond to that security incident, because undoubtedly costs will continue to go up if the depending on the nature of the breach, your possibility or probability of litigation may go up. Some point there's going to be a tipping point where you're going to cross a line and say, okay, this is now material. We've got 4 days to report this on Form 8K. So make sure those things are built into your incident response process. Breaches. We're going to spend a little bit more time here because each of these breaches kind of tell an important story. So healthcare related, Change Healthcare and Ascension Health. Change Healthcare is a subsidiary of United Healthcare who have found themselves unfortunately in the news again. Change Healthcare processes, I think I mentioned this earlier, 40% of all medical claims within the United States. So there's a massive amount of data that they're processing. They were breached sometime this spring. Well, the ransomware was deployed sometime this spring. I think it was March or April, if I recall correctly. Historic averages show us that most threat actors have breached a network and been inside the network for average of 3 months prior to deploying whatever they deploy as their payload. So it's possible that the breach occurred even earlier than than that time. Oh, I'm still on my title slide. I apologize.
Yeah, Christian,
yes.
Why don't we could go back. We could just take a little break and do the polling question really quickly.
Great
and
idea.
Then bounce. Would that be, yeah. Let's get some CP in here for people, and then we will. All right. Go back here. How many hours a day do you spend on remote calls and meetings? A, 1 to 2 hours. B, 2 to 5 hours. C, 5 to 8 hours. D, I lost count. And apologies, I mentioned a CPE progress window, but we actually manually review the poll responses and time attended to award CPE, so you probably will not be seeing that in your console today. All right, we'll give people just one more moment to respond. Here are the results for that. And then Christian, do you want to take us to where you want to go?
Yes. So here, anyway, some intro slides, and these things I believe will still be available, so you can recap this. We've got one more polling question in here, Laura. Do we want to tackle that now?
Let's do it. All right. Has your company completed a cybersecurity assessment in the last year? A, yes. B, no. C, I don't know. Okay. We'll try to give people a few more moments to respond. Here are the results to this one. And then you can take it from here, Christian.
Thank you, Laura. I'll get us back where we need to be. Materiality things, breaches. So breaches. Change Healthcare and Ascension Health. So Change Healthcare, about 100 million people's data was breached, and this is pretty valuable data. To put it into some relative perspective, if you were to go on the dark web, healthcare, a full medical record for an individual, so if I were to get everything on a person and purchase that record, depending on what source you listen to, the total value is less interesting, but the relative value is more interesting. That record's probably worth 10 times more what a stolen credit card is worth. And again, depending on which source you go to for how much those are worth, but there's a very large and consistent multiple on a healthcare record. They're much more valuable than a credit card. The root cause of that issue, there was one remote access point that wasn't fully secured, and someone had stolen a username and password for that. They did not have multi-factor authentication turned on. So these are some fairly simple cybersecurity things that should have been in place that were not in place that resulted in that breach. It was only last month, I believe, that Change Healthcare said their system was fully back online. So it took them 9 months to fully recover that system. The impact from that on a personal level, I don't know how long it will take for those things to be cleaned up. It gets difficult when you have things like children whose records have been breached, social security numbers stolen. It's difficult to handle some of those risks because you can't necessarily go lock their credit score. So that's likely going to create some downstream impacts for quite some time. Ascension Health, this is a $6 billion in revenue hospital network on the East Coast. It took down their entire medical record system for 3 months. I was reading some stories about it, and there were people that almost died because of it, because now things like laboratory results from tests within the hospital were not being returned quickly. Prescription medications were sometimes wrong. There were a lot of problems with it. It all came down to someone clicked on an email they shouldn't have. So lack of multi-factor authentication at Change Healthcare, a phishing email attempt. These are some very kind of rudimentary cybersecurity things that should be done. I'm going to skip over telecommunications, go to Ticketmaster and National Public Data. We'll come back to the telco part because that continues to evolve. So Ticketmaster, they got swept up in, it was actually Snowflake, which is a third-party provider, third-party system, provide a big data type of thing that was breached. Snowflake had there were a number of Snowflake instances that got breached, most of them because they didn't have multi-factor authentication turned on and the bad guys stole usernames and passwords. But Ticketmaster, there are 500 million customers, so now worldwide, who had some of their information stolen and breached. National Public Data, this one kind of flew under the radar. They were sort of a background checking system. You may have seen some of these or advertisements for some where it's like, oh, go find your old high school friends and pay for our service and you can run checks on people. So sometimes their data was old, but there were 2.9 billion personal records stolen as part of that spanned between the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. The company actually just folded. They closed, filed bankruptcy, and shut it down. But a tremendous amount of personal information was stolen in that breach. Locking your credit with the 3 bureaus is one active thing that any human can do to kind of help mitigate some of these risks. So anyways, those are kind of interesting on a personal level. The telecommunications industry, excuse me. So end of September was when these breaches were kind of publicized. Verizon, AT&T, and Lumen were all breached. They came out that the threat actors are a group that Microsoft calls Salt Typhoon. Typhoon is the name that they put on any Chinese nation state actors. So there's a few different groups that are associated with that. So I put on there, they had been breached for 3 months before it was found. Additional data came out since I put this together that actually the Chinese had hacked them about a year ago. So they've been inside those networks for a very long time. The end target was the National Wiretapping Service. So a number of years ago, federal authorities said they wanted the ability to listen in on any communications, phone, text messaging, those sorts of things. That was the end target. This was, from the details that have been released, this was an immensely sophisticated attack. So the bad guys knew exactly what they were doing and did it very well. We don't know the root cause of it. I would imagine we probably never do, at least not for a long time, because of the national security implications from it. This is also why the FBI recently came out and basically told everyone to stop sending text messages and start using protocols or systems that are fully end-to-end encrypted, like Signal. There's a few others out there. But it's fairly significant, I think, when national security related three-letter agencies come out and tell us, like, stop doing the things that you're doing and do this a different way because the security implications are too high. So what does all that mean, and how do we think that the election may impact things? Number one, so I attended a cybersecurity defense conference a few months ago. I've attended a few different things. The message that I've heard consistently out of regulators and policymakers or standards creators is cybersecurity is very much a bipartisan issue in DC. It's one of the few. The likely scenario is that it will not really change. We are likely to continue to see requirements come out. It's possible that we could see some changes in how things are reported. I wouldn't bank on that. And the last thing that I've seen within Washington, D.C. at large is administration changes. It's a while before we start seeing some policy changes trickle through. Given that this is a fairly bipartisan supported subject, I would not expect there to be massive changes. And if there are, I would not expect them to happen quickly. Again, we continue to see bipartisan bills put forward and those sorts of things that continue to drive home the fact that we need to do better here as a country. So I would expect all of that to continue to stay that way. So that is our time. I hope that we're back up to speed. I hope I didn't scare you too much. If there's a takeaway from an organization perspective, don't click the emails, turn on multi-factor authentication. From a personal level, I would highly recommend you go to the 3 credit bureaus and lock your credit. That puts the brakes on a lot of things that can be done if your personal data is stolen. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Christian. And we are going to wrap up with a polling question, the fourth one of this section. After today's presentation, do you plan to make any changes to your cybersecurity protocols? A, yes. B, no. C, I don't know. We'll give some people a few more moments to respond. All right, and the results of that one. And now we're actually going to take a break, about 30 minutes. We will be back at 12:15. So thank you for joining our first section. The second session will be hosted on a different link. There is a link in your console that will take you directly to the second session. If you have any trouble with this link, it is also located in your email and calendar appointments. Hopefully you'll have some time to stretch your legs, get some lunch, catch up on emails, and we will see you back here at 12:15. Before we leave, here is a link to a survey for our first session's presentations. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, and we'll see everyone back at 12:15.